Hello and welcome back to the Pondering Papaya podcast for your preview of the Chinese Grand Prix. Joining me on today's show is pod regular Sarah McKenzie and Mahad from McLaren Fan TV. So let's get straight into it. So as promised, I've got Sarah and Mahad joining me now. First of all, how are you guys doing? How are you, Sarah?
Yeah, good. Excited to be back on.
Yes, and while it's a return to the pod for Sarah, it's also a pod debut for Mahad from McLaren Fan TV. It's good to get you on, Mahad. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you. Thought I should share the papaya love by coming on and, keep a tight-knit community here as McLaren fans. But yeah, thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. It's always good to have new faces and new voices on the pod. Let's get straight into it then, shall we? It's the Chinese Grand Prix this weekend. Obviously, the Shanghai circuit making a return to F1 for 5 years through various pandemics and lockdowns and such. It hasn't been on the schedule for a long time. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you a little refresh of the circuit and what it's all about. The official name of the track is actually the Shanghai Audi International Circuit, which I did not realize they were sponsored by Audi, but obviously that makes a lot of sense. So it's 5.451 kilometers, 56 laps, first held in 2004, but obviously, like I mentioned, 5 years since we last had the race. And that race in 2019 was won by Lewis Hamilton. It was sort of peak Mercedes dominance, really. It was a great time for them. Not such a great time for McLaren, I must admit, in the last race. I was watching back some of the old broadcasts, and I think Lando Norris's race was described as horrific by Ted Kravitz, who's obviously the Sky F1 pit lane reporter. But we'll move on to hopefully some more positive times this year round, but maybe not such a guarantee, because if you've read any of the press releases or sort of the pre-talk about from the team regarding this race, it's all rather pessimistic. I mean, this is a circuit that's not going to suit the McLaren car. Mahad, if I come to you first, sort of what are your general impressions going into this race? What are you sort of expecting to see from McLaren?
I'm not 100% positive like I was going into maybe Suzuka in Australia. I feel like if you was ever to create a track that exposes the weaknesses of this McLaren, it would be this track. And I know we came into a lot of negativity when coming into Bahrain just because of the style of that track and so on. This is even more of an unknown, because if we're considering this is long, slow corners and hairpins and lots and a very, very, very long back straight, and then the finish line straight as well, kind of plays into all the weaknesses of this car. And if we're talking about DRS not being as effective as other teams, that's going to be a problem. Us really, really having problems with handling in this the long higher pins. If it was short, slow speed corners, it wouldn't be too much of an issue. But it's this exact type of corner, kind of like turn 11 in Suzuka, where this car has issues. So for me, I'm kind of going into it as like, just hope for the best this weekend. I think that's all you can do. Let's hope for some chaos. Let's hope for not a normal race, because it's a sprint race on a track that's basically a brand new track for these cars. And let's just hope there's lots of red flags, lots of issues, lots of shuffling of the pack, and then see where McLaren pulls up.
Yeah, we'll get onto the sprint race part of it a little bit later on, because obviously first sprint race of the season. But like you said, looking at this circuit, you could almost custom build it as not one suited to McLaren car. Like you said, a lot of tight hairpins, that back straight in particular being a real weakness of McLaren probably. They're not hugely great on the straights, they're not great on the DRS, like you said. And I did actually look up, this is actually the second longest straight. So Baku has got the longest straight, even though that's not quite a straight line, obviously, but it's still full throttle. But obviously, one of the longest straights in the calendar, which doesn't look that good for McLaren as we sort of go into it. I just want to give you a little quote from Andrea Stella, obviously the team principal. So this is something he said in Suzuka, obviously last race out. He said, of all the tracks in the early part of the calendar, and this is his quote, "This is the track that worries me the most from a competitive point of view." And I think if a team representative is saying that, Sarah, that's not going to be a positive sign, is it, going into a race?
No, but I think, to be fair, unless you're Red Bull in the last few years or Mercedes in the couple of years before that, every team has at least one type of track or at least one track in the season that isn't going to be their friend, and you just have to, as Mahad said, you just have to get through it. You have to hope that you can capitalize where others make mistakes, which I think potentially here this weekend that might be McLaren's best shot. Like if they are going to score points, assuming that they struggle as much as they're expecting to with the car itself, I think there will have to be a bit of drama going on around them. But I do think if that happens, they have drivers that are capable of capitalizing. So I guess maybe that's the silver lining, where at least you're going in knowing that you have two drivers who, if something does go down and an opportunity, a door opens, they're absolutely ready and, able to take that opportunity.
Yeah, and while we're sort of talking about this track not being tailor-made to McLaren, should we say, it's almost the exact opposite for Mercedes, because this is a Mercedes car that's not been great over the course of the season, but if they had to design a track, they probably would have designed one quite similar to this. Like we said, it's basically the anti-McLaren car, isn't it? Like lots of slow speed, that's what it's like, kind of thing. So they could possibly be in the contention, sort of battling McLaren. Mahad, would you agree with that? Do you think that we're going to see sort of Mercedes fighting with McLaren this race a bit more than we've seen in the earlier races this year?
I think it definitely brings them much closer to McLaren. And we kind of saw in Bahrain that was the battle was between kind of McLaren, Mercedes, and Aston Martin. Even though Aston Martin was a little bit behind. It does play to their strength. They're really good in slow corners. We kind of saw that little battle. And I think this kind of symbolizes the difference between McLaren and Mercedes in Jeddah, between Piastri and Hamilton. The long, slow corner at the end, and then the really long straight that made the DRS ineffective, didn't allow Piastri to overtake the Mercedes, and Mercedes was strong in those areas, but bad in sector 1 in Jeddah. It does play to Mercedes' hands. It's really about, okay, like what Sarah said, really capitalizing about, can we out-qualify them? Can we set up the car? Because I know Mercedes had an issue setting up the car in practice session. They've only got one now. So if it's kind of like one and done, if you kind of mess that up, obviously you've got the sprint race and then Park Fermé starts after the sprint race, but you're not really going to have any much running. You're going to go straight into qualifying. So we have to really hope on other people's mistakes. And I think McLaren, that's a strength with theirs, especially last year, getting that car set up immediately, knowing where they're at with it, and kind of hiding pace sometimes in practice sessions. So I think definitely Mercedes is going to be a bit closer, and they're going to come for a stronger.
That is an excellent point you make about the setup, because obviously I think McLaren are one of those right up there, probably with Red Bull, that they find it very easy to get the car in the right window almost instantly. It takes very few laps to do, sort of thing, which is almost the exact opposite of the Mercedes, because I think Toto Wolff has said a number of times this year it's very hard to get the W15 in the right window. So like you've both mentioned so far, we've got a bit of a truncated, disrupted weekend this race, because obviously first sprint race of the season, and if you don't know, there's been a few little changes between last year's sprint event and this one. So whereas last year, Saturday was sort of a sprint day in its own, really. Like you had the sprint qualifying in the morning and then the sprint race in the afternoon. That's been switched up a little bit. So now we're going to have free practice 1 on Friday morning as usual, but then we're going to have sprint qualifying on the Friday afternoon. And then in the Saturday morning, sprint race, and then qualifying for the main race on Saturday afternoon, and then obviously the main race on Sunday. But as well as like all the timings, there's also been quite a significant change in terms of Parc Fermé. So in the old rules, it was very much you had one session and then that was it. As soon as it went to qualifying, Parc Fermé was in effect, so teams couldn't change their car. Sort of explains why we saw incidents like Hamilton and Leclerc being disqualified in Austria, simply because their car was too low. They probably didn't have enough time to do the setup changes that they needed. So now it's going to be still before qualifying, but obviously qualifying is much later on the weekend now. So teams are going to have a bit more data, a bit more chance to sort of assess where their car's at and sort of get the setup right. Looking at the sprint race in general, the fact that it is the first one in China, and like we said, it's probably not a track that McLaren are overly strong at. Sarah, do you think having a sprint race hurts or helps McLaren's chances this weekend?
Good question. I think potentially it helps because you have more opportunities to score points, right? Like you have to at least go in with a positive attitude if that's the scenario. I think also I agree. I think the Parc Fermé situation is probably the most impactful change they've made to the sprint format, because I actually think this is where a lot of teams could mess up. Like we just said, some teams just are not good at adapting their setup, and it is a different setup between those two scenarios. So like, who is going to be more capable of, first of all, figuring out what works? Because as we said multiple times already, we haven't been to this track since 2019. And then secondly, which drivers can then adapt to the way that they need to drive to figure that out. I think, again, I'll come back to the fact that like McLaren have two smart, energetic young guys in those cars. Like, they are very well placed, and potentially the sprint could open things up. And even if, let's say, the sprint went well and the Grand Prix didn't, at least you've still secured some form of points, would be my attitude, trying to be like as glass half full as possible.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think Lando Norris is probably one of the few drivers that actually likes the less practice time as possible. I'm pretty sure he's very much willing to go straight into the competitive action he could. He's almost the anti-Max Verstappen in that regard, isn't he? Because Max wants as much practice time as possible and then gets into the car, whereas Lando is clearly, obviously, very happy to go straight into the car, pretty much. Very happy to get in the car and go. But just moving away from China a little bit, because obviously it's the first sprint race of the season, but what's both of your views on the general sprint vibe? Because we've had it for a few years now. Obviously, it's been quite, not a controversial subject, but one that gets a lot of people talking. There's been people for it, people against it. Pretty much you could find anyone with any kind of opinion on the sprint. So what do you guys make of it? Did you like the sprint? Do you think these changes are good? And then also bearing in mind, because obviously this is China, we haven't raced this since 2019. It's the first sprint race of the year. Is that going to be an issue for the teams?
I'll tackle the second part on that. I think China, in this scenario of not being there for 5 years, the new cars never been on this track. This truck never really having cars on there. They don't really do races on this track. And I think possibly the track's been resurfaced as well. This is a complete unknown. This is like the first time a sprint race has happened at a brand new race. That for these teams, because the data that they had in 2019 is basically worthless on this track with these cars. So we might look at maybe like a Turkey 2020 type of situation. Might see some rental cars going out to put some rubber down on the track. It could be an awkward scenario doing it. And I think a lot of the drivers think this is one of the worst tracks to do this on. Just because we haven't been here, we need free practice sessions. And you never hear about drivers wanting practice sessions, but they need it here, basically. Sprints overall, I'm not a fan of it particularly. Maybe I'm a bit of an old school fan, but I don't really get it. I don't know why I'm watching this. I understand why there's sprint races in the feeder series. Obviously, you want to give them as much opportunity as possible to go around the track and get the mileage in. But for Formula One, if you're going to do something like a sprint race, it needs to be completely different to the race. And I feel like it's just a preview of the race. It's kind of like, I've used this analogy before. It's kind of like you're having a nice dinner. Let's say you're having a nice roast dinner. And then all of a sudden, they take the plate away from you halfway through. And they say, no, you can eat it tomorrow. You can finish the rest tomorrow. That is what the sprint race is. And I think it has to kind of distinguish itself as a different thing. And it really needs to have its completely different rules compared to, I don't know, maybe a rolling start, something completely different to a Formula One race to make it its own thing. And then maybe people will talk about, the sprint race championship, maybe, and people getting their accolades that way, maybe doing a reverse grid. But the iteration of it at the moment, I am not a fan, because it's just a preview of the race. And I like Sarah said, now we've got Parc Fermé. People are going to have a sprint race. They've previewed the race. Then they can set up the car how they want to in the race. So it kind of takes away the unpredictability of the actual race itself.
Hello there, listeners. Sam here, interrupting just a few brief moments to tell you how you can win a Lando Norris 2024 baseball cap. To be in with a chance of winning, all you need to do is answer the following question. What year and what race did Lando Norris score his first F1 podium? If you think you know the answer, email inbox@ponderingpapaya.com. That's inbox@ponderingpapaya.com, including your name and where we should send the cap should you win. The competition is open to everybody and we're going to close it at the end of April, so get your answers in now. Now let's get back to the show.
Sarah, I'll come to you now. Are we going to see drivers be even more cautious this year? Because obviously, I think that's Max Verstappen's main point, is he's always said that there's not enough reward in the sprint race to make you risk hurting your chances late in the weekend. But obviously, now that we're going to have the sprint race on the Saturday morning, there's going to be a few hours before quali, which is obviously much more important in terms of the general weekend. Do you think that's going to make drivers even more scared of like pushing the limits and crashing the car up?
I think that's, to be honest, since sprints were introduced, that's always been my argument against them, is that I don't believe that the teams are willing to take the level of risk that's required to make it interesting. And I think that will always be the case, particularly going forward, like we're in this era of sustainability. You know, like Williams don't even have enough chassis for like 2 cars on a given Grand Prix weekend, never mind taking a higher level of risk, as you said, hours before qualifying. I think Formula One is not built, at least in its current state, to house a sprint format and have it really add much value. But from an organizational standpoint and from certainly a money standpoint, I understand it. I just don't think it's just not quite there, is it? You know, like they've tweaked it a number of times, but I think at the end of the day, the product doesn't match with the long-term strategy that F1 is trying to follow. And at the end of the day, like that is going to always be the case if we continue down the road that we're on.
Yeah, and it's clear to see that F1 does plan to continue, because in their mind, it's a good way to get more people in on the Friday, on the Saturday, get some competitive action at least. So I think we are going to see sprints a bit more as the years go on, not just this year, because obviously we've got 6 of them. But if we take a look now at sort of the wider grid, and I think this is probably the first time since we started the show in pre-season that there hasn't been any huge off-track drama in between races. There's not been some kind of scandal. So it's nice that we actually get to focus on the racing a little bit. And let's move to the front of the grid. We've got Red Bull and Ferrari, sort of clearly the top 2 teams so far this year. They're both the teams that obviously only ones that have won a race so far. Thinking about China, do you think Red Bull are going to be a step ahead? Because this sort of looks like a track that favours them, doesn't it? Like, it's got long straights, and we know that Verstappen and Perez and the Red Bull in general, very good under DRS. And if it's probably going to be quite unlikely, but if Max is ever in a situation where he gets DRS, then you're probably going to see him go 20 seconds down the road, aren't you? It's going to be a very easy overtake for him. Do you think another easy win is sort of how it's going to play out, Mahat?
I think definitely they've got the perfect balance in terms of having that straight line speed while still being competitive in other areas of the track. And for Red Bull, going into every weekend, they're going to look like the favourites, unless they have an issue with setup or maybe the track surface or anything like that, and the relationship, how their car is with the track surface. So that could be the case this weekend, just because of how weird this situation is. I think it's highly unlikely, but with Red Bull, you never know. It could be another Singapore for them. But I think right now, they're a step ahead of everybody else, and it's kind of clear at the moment. It's funny because Andrea Stella, when he kind of outlined the targets for the season, it was kind of like Perez and Ferrari. That's our first step to target. Then it's Max. So like Max is a different league at the moment. So maybe Perez may struggle, but for sure, I don't think Max is going to have any problems around China.
And if we just relate it back to McLaren, Sarah, like, I think going into the year, the goal probably was to sort of not maybe overtake, but definitely catch up on the gap between Ferrari, Red Bull, and McLaren themselves. But as we've sort of seen this year so far, it hasn't really played out like that. Those two have clearly been the best teams. McLaren has obviously been the third best team by quite a distance, but with no major upgrades to Imola, so sort of 2-3 races time, are McLaren going to be too far behind? And considering how dominant those two teams have been so far, do you think they're going to be playing a little bit of a dangerous game, accepting being third right now?
I don't think so. I think they're pretty much on track for, Zach Brown has been over the last couple of years talking about playing a long game, and he talked about winning races around 2025. So I think if you're to look at that and work backwards from there, it kind of makes sense that they would be in that third spot trying to move into second. I do think Ferrari have the jump on them a little bit, particularly with Carlos Sainz, who's obviously been smashing it. Leclerc not so much, but still still kind of like somehow managing to skirt his way around. I think certainly the Red Bulls are too far away, but I don't know. I think like we saw the massive leap McLaren made with their first upgrades last year. Like nobody could really believe it. I think even they were shocked. So I think if that happens again, they could absolutely find themselves closer to Ferrari, but I think that's probably a realistic goal. I think, Verstappen in particular is just like sailing away. I mean, I read today that the last time we were racing in China, he only had 5 race wins and he'd never had a pole position. Like we are in a very different place 5 years later. So look, it is what it is. But we can focus on the entertainment that's happening further back at least.
Yeah, I must say I've done a few pieces recently where I'm sort of comparing China 2019 to where F1 is now. And if you want a main example of someone whose life's completely changed, you've got to pick Verstappen. Like he's gone from quite a potentially young rookie, like looking like good, but now he's sort of the fully fledged thing, arguably one of the best ever to do it. And like you said, the number of wins, the number of titles, the number of pretty much everything he's racked up since then is really quite impressive. But if we step away from Red Bull for a minute, and I think probably one of the most interesting dynamics we're going to see over the course of the season would come at Ferrari, where, let's be honest, Sainz is spoiling the party. This was not in the plan, was it? When Hamilton's announced that everyone's thinking maybe Leclerc's going to have a good year, maybe Hamilton's going to have a good year, but the one person who is having a good year is Carlos Sainz. Obviously, he won that race in Australia, having been out of the race the weekend before due to the appendix issue. But Mahab, what do you think about this whole scenario? Like, is it going to be... I mean, for now, Sainz and Leclerc seem like the best of friends, good teammates kind of thing. As the year goes on, is that going to continue? Because, I mean, it can't really, can it?
I don't think it will be the latter, because with Carlos Sainz, we know how ruthless he can be. He's very, very targeted and like mentally strong individual. And right now he's fighting for his F1 life. Even though there might be offers on the table and so on, he's technically hasn't got a drive for 2025. So he's going to go all out in any opportunity. If there is a scenario where they're possibly going to maybe execute team orders and they ask him to do something for Leclerc, expect radio silence. Because there is no need for him to actually play the team game this year. He's literally driving for himself. And you can see it. He's completely determined. The guy had his appendix taken out and won the next race. This is like unheard of stuff. I remember Coulthard having a plane accident and then winning in Magny-Cours. That's the kind of level of stuff that he did. He literally he was on a surgery bed and won. And I think as the car has got easier to drive, because that's what they were focusing on last year. There was actual race weekends where they basically made it a testing session. We saw that in Zandvoort. They really kind of admitted, look, the direction we went in, Ferrari, wasn't the right direction, and we're going to use the second half of the season to kind of go change direction. And they were good in the last year as well. So they are where they are. But as the car has got easier to drive, it's kind of playing into Sainz's hands now, because Leclerc could drive a car on the edge. He can kind of deal with that. And now he's having issues with switching on tyres. Stuff that we have not really seen from Charles Leclerc. And it's never really been like a massive gap between the two. So if there is a slight advantage car-wise going one way, Carlos Sainz is definitely going to take advantage of that. So it's going to be nip and tuck. We're literally a drain cover away from Sainz being 2-1 up on Leclerc in seasons. So the fact that he's got a bit of a head, he's been disadvantaged because obviously he didn't have a race. He missed a race, but it's going to be nip and tuck between the two, and I think it's going to get maybe a little bit spicier as the season goes on.
And I am very much for that. We love a bit of drama, don't we? I'm going to ask you a hard question now, Sarah, and that's what we want, don't we? We love a bit of drama. And I've just, as you were talking, I realised that Carlos Sainz may be the most unlucky man on the planet, because obviously he was the one that had the drain coverage in Vegas, and now he's had the appendix out. But moving back to McLaren, Sarah, I'm going to ask you a hard question. I appreciate it's a little bit unfair. You've got a race tomorrow. Are you putting Norris or Leclerc in your car?
Oh, what's the car?
it's not a McLaren or Ferrari. Let's say it's an Alpine, completely neutral. Neither driver's ever driven with them, so both a new car for them.
Ugh. I think if it's an underperforming car or a car that I expect to be a bit tricky, I think I'm probably putting Norris in because I think he's more likely to. I feel like he'll like fight with a car and win. You know what I mean? Like I feel like he will find a way to overcome. I don't always see that from Leclerc. He finds issues, you know, where, as Mahad said, we maybe hadn't seen them happen before to him. I think I put Norris in that car. Might be a big call, but I'm going with Norris.
I like it. I like big calls. That's very much what we're here for. Just a final team I want to touch on. You sort of mentioned them briefly there, but it is Alpine. I mean, this isn't a team that's just hit the panic button. Like, if you imagine a red button with the words panic on it, they've hit it so many times that you can't even read panic anymore. It's very much problem times at the French team, which is obviously weird because a few years ago they were fighting with McLaren. The reason I bring them up for this race in particular is that we've now heard that they're going to bring an updated floor just for Ocon. They haven't had time to make one for Gasly as well. And just to sort of hopefully kickstart their year. Like, it's been a dreadful start to the season. Mahad, do you think this floor upgrade is going to be enough? Is it going to sort of have a McLaren-esque level upgrade as we saw last year? Or do you think they can't really make that much ground in that short little time?
I think, personally, Alpine are in big trouble. New floor or not, they're in big trouble because we're talking about it's like systematic issues from the top down to the bottom, and even their powers under the engines underpowered, like just stuff like that. Like these are problems that kind of span over seasons, let alone over one season. So I think, are they going to find a magic bullet in this new floor? Probably maybe gain maybe a 10th or two, but I feel like what the season overall with these teams, there's a clear gap between the top 5 and the bottom 5. And I think they're cemented in that bottom 5, whether they move from being the worst team to maybe the 7th best team, it doesn't really matter. They shouldn't really be there in the first place. And the step backwards they've taken over the last 2 years, we're looking at them being clearly better than McLaren in 2022 to where they are now. And it's bad.
Yeah, like I said, it's very weird having Alpine essentially being one of McLaren's, if not McLaren's biggest rival. They were fighting for P4 at one point together. Now they're just at completely different ends of the grid. So let's finish it off today with a little bit of predictions, because who doesn't like predictions? Where do we think? I mean, we've been talking a bit negatively, not negatively, but obviously a bit cautiously about what McLaren can achieve this race. So I'm going to start with you. Sort of, what are you predicting for McLaren? Do you think it's going to be a points finish? Is a podium possible? Like, where are you predicting McLaren to be this sort of season? Sorry, this race.
Big question. I think points is probably the best they can hope for as far as being within the top 10. It might seem, and it seems drastic because they've been doing so well, but I think when a team is, and I do find McLaren to be quite an honest team in their comms, I think when they're saying we are going to struggle massively and you know that technically the car isn't suited to the track, I think that's fair enough. I don't think it's like playing the media. So I think, you know, points would be good for them. I think, as I said earlier on, if they can capitalize on the chaos, then amazing. But I don't think it's going to be a podium this time around.
Mahad, coming to you, is that sort of your similar thinking as well?
Yeah, I think capitalizing on the chaos. Hopefully, I need there to be rain, so the like DRS is not enabled or something like that. Something like really out of the blue where everybody's on wet tires, intermediates. That kind of needs to happen. Personally, I think points finish is nailed on. Even if it's 9th or 10th, it's happening because I feel like the gap between the top 5 and the bottom 5 is too large. Is it going to be, maybe we're dragged more towards the Mercedes and Aston Martin battle? Yes, probably. But if there is issues going on, if there are DNFs, unexpected DNFs ahead of us with the Ferraris or Red Bulls or anybody like that, podium could be possible. Who knows? But I'm going to be conservative and maybe say 5th.
Yeah, I did forget to mention that there is actually some rain forecast over the course of the weekend, so that could hopefully lead to some interesting sessions. But in the meantime, we're going to be back on Sunday, obviously, for a full race recap. And My thanks go to both of you for joining me once again. I'm sure we'll get both of you on later in the season.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sam.
My thanks go to both Sarah and Mahad for joining me today, and my thanks to you for listening along as well. We'll be back on Sunday for a full recap of the race in Shanghai, but in the meantime, make sure you're following us on socials at Pondering Papaya, and make sure you're subscribed on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you get your pods, and give us a 5-star review while you're at it. We'll see you on Sunday.